Hello, fellow Earthlings. Welcome to our corner of the universe for this week's episode of Space Times Podcast. I'm Harrison Lambert here with Paul Mayer, talking about all the happenings this week in space and sharing our opinions with you.
Well, Harrison, thank you so much for hopping on another call with me. Always a pleasure. A couple of big developments in the industry over the past week or so that we get to talk about today. The first of which I think hits a little bit close to home for both of us, but the recent announcement of Intuitive Machines acquiring Lanteris. That was announced, I believe, earlier in the week, but both of us sort of coming up through Space Systems Loral and Maxar technologies. It's got to be an interesting experience for you as well, I would imagine, to see how far Space Systems Loral and Maxar have come in the time since we've been working with them.
Yeah, I think this is probably the most complete acquisition of Space Systems Loral. It was always kind of taken by other companies and kept on its own, but this very much seems like it's going to be integrated into the larger company that is Intuitive Machines. So it's a little bittersweet to kind of see it, to me, feeling like it's going away. But hopefully there's some value there for Intuitive Machines and for SSL to continue living on in that company.
Yeah. It looks like Intuitive Machines is pretty interested in the power and propulsion element contract for the Artemis 3 program that SSL won, or I guess that Maxar won back in the time that we were there. We both got to work on that, which was a lot of fun, I'm sure. But
Yep.
interesting to see Space Systems Loral, or the business and teams formerly known as Space Systems Loral, being acquired largely off the value of that one contract. Now some of their biggest contracts have already been executed on and are up on orbit, like Worldview Legion and Jupiter 3, among others. But big news out of the space industry either way. Congratulations to everyone at Lanteris and to everyone at Maxar on the pivot and the successful execution. And congratulations to everyone at Intuitive Machines. They've brought on a whole bunch of excellent capacity and capability.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, most of the values in that PPE. Like a lot of the Geocom contracts, like you said, have already been executed. I know there's some in their backlog, but the amount of outstanding debt they carry in relation to that kind of operations, I think it kind of balances out and doesn't add much value to Intuitive Machines. And a lot of the technology is pretty old at this point, that these more proliferated constellations of communication networks are probably going to render a lot of that technology more or less obsolete. I know that Maxar Lanteris had designs for a proliferated LEO constellation in a bid for some of these communication constellations. So there might also be some value there in that design. But I think and again, the Legion satellites, like Vantor is going to continue ordering more of them, presuming that it's operating as well in orbit as they're saying that it is. So there's some cash flow possibility there as well. And also being able to build satellites that have some state-of-the-art imaging. And as we've seen with recent, worldview space-to-space imaging, some implications towards space domain awareness, which there might be some effort by Intuitive Machines to try to get a foothold in that kind of market as well, since there's a lot of money flowing through there that could help fund their lunar aspirations. But I think, as you noted, the PPE, the power propulsion element, is the most important contract that Lanteris holds in relation to Intuitive Machines' core business, which is to provide the core power and propulsion unit for the Artemis mission, which is a fairly large component of that entire system. And Intuitive Machines already has the contracts for some lunar landers, so they kind of have both sides of the Artemis mission now within their control, which I think will give them a really strong foothold for not just being part of the Artemis mission, but also developing the technology needed for lunar exploration, which will really build out their main core business case.
Yeah. One of the contracts that we actually bid on at Maxar was the same lunar lander side of the I believe LTV.
Yeah.
But one of the contracts that we wound up bidding on, we didn't win it at Maxar, was that same end stage, end step side of the Artemis program. So interesting and encouraging to see that Intuitive Machines is incorporating all of that capability and all of that talent and capacity into one roof.
Yeah, and I think last week we talked about them getting extension on their nuclear power research. So I think there's also some interplay there with some of the technology that they're already pursuing in terms of a power unit for the larger system.
Yeah, there's some pretty clear overlap and potential synergies moving forward that one can see. But again, congratulations to everybody involved. We're happy to see it happen and wish all parties nothing but the best. But in addition to the big news out of Lanteris and Intuitive Machines, there was an additional follow-on, and this is something that we spoke about a couple of months ago. But the SpaceX EchoStar Spectrum deal has an additional 2.6 billion in stock. So previously, we'd spoken about the 17 billion combined cash stock. I believe it was ballpark of 10 billion, 7 billion cash and stock, respectively. And there's an additional 2.6 billion. So all in all, EchoStar looks like it's holding about 10 billion in SpaceX stock after the sale of some extensive spectrum to SpaceX. And as a result, EchoStar is breaking out EchoStar Capital specifically to hold these asset-light investments, specifically to hold these equities and to presumably or potentially start making more investments derived therefrom in the coming months and the coming years here. So EchoStar selling off a lot of their spectrum deal, selling off a lot of their own capacity and capability to some of the bigger competitors in the space, and potentially looking at making an operations pivot to more of a financing or more of a soft tech based background than what they've been doing traditionally.
Yeah, it seems like they're really trying to just exit the market with this sale. There's no intention of, kind of folding it into SpaceX or keeping some of its business alive. It really is a pure spectrum acquisition.
Yeah, and this is a huge boon for SpaceX's direct-to-device capabilities. We've spoken about this a couple of times, that the D2D space is likely going to be shaping up to be sort of one of the next big capabilities races, one of the next big capabilities wars in the telecommunications space. And it looks like SpaceX is really pushing the envelope and really trying to advance and move things forward. That being said, Starlink and Virgin Media have already rolled out a direct-to-cell satellite telecom in the UK. So we're already seeing this happen and play out in real time. And one of the big, I'll say, casualties potentially or consequences of this is something that I'm really excited to talk with you about, but the prospect of the Globalstar sale. So Harrison, if you'll follow me down the rabbit hole, Globalstar.
I'll follow you anywhere, buddy.
So the Globalstar sale to SpaceX is predicated on the current relationship between Globalstar and Apple. So Apple is currently talking with Globalstar, and they're saying, hey, great, we're going to work together. Apple is going to build their entire next generation of devices with the architecture and the hardware, the necessary chips, the necessary setup, such that they can work with the Globalstar constellation that's being built, the Globalstar MDA constellation that was being built, in order to provide D2D services to their customers. Apple has considered pulling out of that agreement. Now, this is all speculation. We're not reporting anything here, but Apple has been talking with SpaceX. Hey, we've been talking with Globalstar about doing this. Maybe we should just be talking with SpaceX instead, because SpaceX is doing so well in this direct-to-device market. So as a result, Apple potentially pulling that Globalstar contract means that Globalstar canceled a contract with MDA, who was making for them an extensive constellation, and it also puts at risk a similar contract with Rocket Lab. Now, we all think of Rocket Lab primarily as a launch company, but the majority of their revenues actually come from on-orbit operations. The majority of their revenues actually come from contracts and satellites that they build and sell and provide services to their customers with. And so Rocket Lab has a $143 million contract with Globalstar. And if Globalstar looks at closing up shop and selling out, exiting the market, Globalstar certainly is not going to need that hardware. They're certainly not going to need those contracts. So SpaceX winds up buying out Globalstar. Well, we can basically assume that SpaceX is going to be using Starlink satellites for this, but they're not really going to be buying out Rocket Lab satellites in order to provide direct-to-device capability. So this whole agreement between Apple and Globalstar puts that contract at risk. Now, the next layer of this is that Rocket Lab is looking at making some acquisitions, presumably to execute on that contract for Globalstar, which is now at risk. So Rocket Lab is looking at acquiring Mynaric for up to 150 million. It's currently under review by the German government, making sure that everything's copacetic and there's no monopolization that's happening here. Everything passes board. Antitrust is cleared. But Rocket Lab is looking at buying Mynaric for $75 million today, $75 million upfront, combined cash and stock at Rocket Lab's discretion, and the potential for a $75 million earnout in, again, combined cash and stock at Rocket Lab's discretion over the coming years. And so that acquisition itself is Rocket Lab purchasing a telecommunications relay component that would be a key player and a key vertical supplier and integration for executing on this potential Globalstar contract. So because Apple is potentially not going to be going with Globalstar, two separate contracts that Globalstar had to buy hardware to fulfill Apple's needs have both been put at risk. One of them has already been canceled. Another might potentially be canceled. And because of that, the company that's executing or planning to execute on that contract itself is potentially going to be acquiring another company with no use, or that acquisition itself is at risk as well. So there's a lot of second and third order effects here, from Apple potentially choosing to go with SpaceX over Globalstar in the direct-to-device solution space. And it's got so many different potential implications that I wanted to talk about it because it's so interesting to me.
Yeah, it really shakes up the direct-to-device industry at a time when it's already moving so much, just in terms of funding and projects being announced and portions of constellations being launched. I look at these acquisitions and potential acquisitions by SpaceX as almost a defensive action in trying to put up roadblocks for the broader efforts outside of America, out of Starlink-based constellations. As you mentioned, when they bought EchoStar, that kind of shuttered the deal with MDA to build their constellation. So that being a Canadian company, brought that, that constellation stateside. It'll be fully Starlink, and something similar would likely happen with Globalstar, in that they could push out Rocket Lab, and Rocket Lab wouldn't have a constellation contract to work on either. Rocket Lab's technically American, but they're also New Zealand. So again, this is kind of American companies shouldering out foreign satellite producers from this constellation race. It puts them in a pretty tough position because a lot of these constellation contracts have been bid years ago and are kind of at the stages where they're being built and deployed. So to have to take whatever investment they've already put into these constellations and go find a new buyer for it is certainly going to be challenging. There's probably an appetite for it in Europe, as we're seeing recently, with collaborations such as Telesat working with the Lightspeed Squared mission to develop their constellation there, and the AST Space Mobile partnership with Germany to develop constellations for European telecom providers. So there's certainly some market to be had there, but it looks like Starlink is really playing zone defense for the American market and trying to push into the European market, as we saw with that Virgin Media partnership in UK, to try to expand their business at a time when Europe is very loudly saying they want to get away from relying on Starlink and build up that sovereign capability.
Yeah. It's I would say sort of to your point that there's some definite offensive aspects here of what SpaceX is doing. Tomato a little bit probably with how we're defining things, but SpaceX is very much trying to gobble up as much of the market share as they can before any of the other competitors are able to actually get products to market. SpaceX clearly wants to be the first to market with D2D capabilities, and they clearly think that's going to be a sustainable and sticky customer set. And so with the similarities between the EchoStar MDA contract and the Globalstar Rocket Lab contract are pretty stark, and the implications of SpaceX trying to maintain a market dominant position in the European market when Europe has, to your point, so clearly and loudly said that they want sustainable sovereign capability throughout the entirety of the space ecosystem from launch through operations. That's going to be an uphill battle. Thank you, by the way, for correcting me. I misspoke earlier. The MDA contract was with EchoStar, not with Globalstar.
I'm just going to put my prediction out there that SpaceX does acquire Globalstar, cancels the Rocket Lab contract, and the Mynaric contract goes through, and Rocket Lab is partnered with Germany, just like quite a few other companies are starting to do. Because it also intertwines York Space with Rocket Lab. So I think kind of entangling all these other smaller space companies with European interests, I think is to the benefit of everyone if their goal really is to try to compete against SpaceX, because it just forms this giant consortium of economic interests in each other's success.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think that the acquisition of Mynaric is purely or explicit. Well, I think the executing on the Globalstar contract is a major motivator for the potential Mynaric acquisition by Rocket Lab. I do not think that is the sole purpose of it. We've already spoken several times. We've made several episodes now hitting the fact that Germany is dedicating 50 billion, 40 billion, and all the king's men to the space domain capabilities, and there's a lot of contract money to be won in that, and not all of it is going to go to Rheinmetall. So the fact that Rocket Lab would potentially want to buy a German company to be able to get a foothold in Germany so that they can do some business and bid on and win some of those contracts, that also makes perfect sense. So even if the contract and the immediate value add of Mynaric's expertise and capability on executing on the $140 million Globalstar contract winds up falling through, Rocket Lab is still looking at executing on 40 plus billion of government contracts that they only need to win. They only need to win a little slice of that in order to wind up way ahead on the acquisition overall. So I'd agree with that, and I think I would probably second your opinion that SpaceX, I would think, probably is going to buy Globalstar. They certainly want to be. They certainly have demonstrated a desire to roll up and acquire and consolidate as much as they can. And I think that the contract to Rocket Lab is likely to be canceled if they do make the acquisition. And I think that Rocket Lab would still likely have good reason to follow through on the acquisition with Mynaric, even if that contract with Globalstar falls through.
Yeah.
Closer to home, there's some big news updates as well. Most notably, the FAA has issued a temporary curfew for commercial launches. due to some of the staffing challenges the FAA and air traffic controllers have experienced during the government shutdown, the FAA has issued a temporary cease and hold on all commercial launches, so that the workload necessary on the air traffic controllers in the system as it currently stands could be alleviated a little bit. So that's an unforeseen schedule slip for everybody in the commercial sector, but it is a solvable one as well. So once things open up and we get back on track, it looks like launches will be able to commence again at the same rate and at the same cadence. And simultaneously, as this is going on, SpaceX is advocating and pushing for more exceptions and commercial licenses to be provided, specifically to try and alleviate this schedule slip as well. So big news, big development.
Yeah.
And lots of folks are working to try and solve this problem.
Yeah, it's definitely a detriment to a lot of smaller space companies and just satellite operators in general trying to get to orbit. And that's terrible to hear that it's going to push back on all of their timelines. But it also, has a unfortunate effect on some of these rocket or launch providing companies that had plans to, have some pretty high profile launches this year before it was over, such as Firefly, planning to have a couple more launches, and New Glenn just planning to launch today. They had to scrub on the pad, so it'll be interesting to see if this curfew is going to push that launch even further out, which would be really, really bad to see because the mission they're flying is Escapade, which is a Mars mission. So the transfer window they need is not very lenient. So we hope to see launches pick up to normal pace soon.
Yeah. One of the benefits of the U.S. government being run by people is that people are pretty adaptable and pretty innovative. So similarly, when there was earlier in the year, there was sort of a quick moratorium, like, hey, no more government travel whatsoever. So there were a couple of different conferences that I was in attendance for that were intended to be largely government focused. And the first of those conferences, folks hadn't yet figured out how to solve the problem. They hadn't yet figured out a workaround. But for the second of those conferences, just a few weeks later, they had solved that. And so there was already sort of workarounds and ways to be able to keep things flowing and operating effectively. So hopefully, to your point, these launches, especially the ones with such strict timelines, hopefully these launches are able to commence again soon. Note that it's just commercial launches, so maybe there's a way to try and classify some of the different projects that are being launched to classify or describe them as more defense related or national security related. But hopefully there's a way to find some sort of alleviation to the buildup, because an undisclosed major delay and shock to the ecosystem and supply chain would represent a pretty big negative impact on the industry. So I'm optimistic that we'll be able to solve this and get around this, but this is absolutely a big hiccup for space. Another big headline that we wanted to talk about comes from Payload's Space Investor Summit this past week out in Los Angeles, at which Gravitics unveiled their, quote, Diamondback orbital carrier. So Diamondback was introduced. It's a small orbital carrier and was pitched for missions varying in application, from defending U.S. national security satellites to space-based interceptors. So this is something that we've spoken about previously, the idea of space-to-space defense and space-to-space asset or adversarial interception. And so we're seeing multiple companies, Gravitics being one of them, making some pretty explicit plays and efforts in that space. this comes in tandem with the growth and proliferation of space domain awareness and being more aware of the other assets and the other debris that is up there on orbit. And I don't believe that these trends are going to change anytime soon. It certainly looks like the ability to interfere and potentially subvert satellites' capabilities and satellites' missions with orbital assets of one's own is something that the ecosystem is rapidly defending against, despite that capability not already being demonstrated.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the kind of satellite that they're proposing for this particular use case. It does remind me a bit more of like Arc and their inversion spacecraft that was also very recently mentioned, but they are pretty squarely positioning it to be a space-based interceptor platform. So more in line with what Apex was announcing with their orbital magazine solution. I have a feeling that there's some dual purpose use going on here with Gravitics, and maybe they were building in stealth for one use case. I would think orbital stations more like VAST and Axiom, but saw the writing on the wall that a lot of companies seem to be seeing in regards to Golden Dome, and realize that it's a perfect platform for hosting things like space-based interceptors. I think this kind of design does make a bit more sense for those kind of applications than say Apex, but I'm really curious to see how it will fit into the broader design of orbital, like persistent orbital structures. I mean, they talk a little bit about it being like on orbit storage for satellite defense. So even though most of what they're talking about is space-based interception and satellite-to-satellite defense, I think it could also be useful for things like refueling and just hosting large things on orbit, like orbital data centers. Another use case that companies like Axiom explores with their kind of platform. So the design definitely predisposes them to certain applications, and I think they're really hitting on some that are really flashy right now. I think, yeah, space-based interceptors is part of a large $1.3 trillion contract. It's something barely anybody's competing with, so it's kind of a blue ocean space for business. And I mean, it seems like a smart way to come out of stealth with their platform and draw on that money to build it up.
So in line with the space-based interceptors and the growth and proliferation of space domain awareness, Slingshot Aerospace has recently won a provision of optical delivery partner contract with the UK Space Agency in order to deploy 13 new optical sensor systems to improve space domain awareness for the UK Space Agency. So folks are already putting putting their money where their mouths are all across the industry as space domain awareness becomes more and more of a driving force in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it really builds out UK's capabilities. Since they're not part of the EU, they're not going to benefit from a lot of the developments that they're having for this technology. But they are still partnered with the US in kind of a unique way, separate from the EU, with the AUKUS coalition to deploy the DARK network, which is the Earth-based radar telescope kind of distributed system for mapping space assets. So this seems like it would just augment that kind of capability. But it's definitely interesting to see them trying to build this out further, especially if they still have US willing to foot the bill for a lot of this stuff. I think they could on more of the US capabilities than the rest of the EU could. So yeah, I think the investment here is pretty clear. UK, like the EU, is positioning itself in anticipation that the US is not going to support its efforts anymore. And since the UK has made quite a few moves to bolster their aerospace capabilities. I think this is a key technology that they're going to need to continue to incubate.
I think that does it for all of the big major news announcements that we wanted to make. There's a handful of things that we wanted to talk about in the lightning round here, some funding raises, some mergers and acquisitions, and then a couple of tech developments here, but let's jump into it. So OHB recently announced that they were going to be taking 100% of MT Aerospace, and they're acquiring the remaining 30% of MT Aerospace, who is an Ariane 6 supplier, which strengthens sort of their defense-focused positioning here. But I know this is one that you were excited to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, OHB is a large telecom. Well, they're a large space systems provider in Germany. One of their biggest contracts was for Galileo, which is the EU's GPS solution. So they've been around for a while. They've had some big contracts. They're more of the traditional large satellite provider kind of option in the EU, and one of Germany's few that are operate at that scale. So I know last week we talked about Leonardo, Thales, Airbus partnering together, and that wipes out a lot of the very large space companies in Europe. So seeing one of the remaining ones kind of grow in this way is fascinating, because it is kind of a pivot away from their primary business. It kind of expands their capability, but it makes sense given what we've seen with Germany over the past few weeks. Between their $60 billion investment, the $3 billion Rheinmetall contract, the constant flow of funding to German companies, and all these partnerships between Germany and other space companies, some of the moves of Avio to Germany for manufacturing, and I believe, like I mentioned, AST Space Mobile with their manufacturing in Germany. It just seems like there's a lot of consolidation around Germany being one of the key hubs to the next generation of aerospace in Europe. So this kind of acquisition is interesting to see that OHB, while more legacy, might be taking a larger stake in the next stage of European space, particularly with this Ariane 6, which is supposed to be the next generation of launch vehicle that a lot of European space companies are working on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, part of that consolidation in Europe can be seen in some of the raises that we've seen announced as well. So Reflex Aerospace raised a 50 million euro Series A specifically to improve Germany's satellite manufacturing capabilities. So we're already seeing Germany throughout the value chain consolidating and investing extensively.
Yeah.
And then additionally, Endurosat announced a raise of over 100 million from Riot, GV, and Lux Capital for small satellite production. Endurosat, if memory serves, is a Bulgarian. Endurosat is a Bulgarian satellite manufacturer, and this again plays in with the ongoing trend of Europe and the ESA intentionally prioritizing self-sufficiency and sovereign capability all throughout this traditional and new space economies.
Yeah, it's a real benefit to distribute satellite manufacturing throughout Europe too. So, and just from a physical standpoint, like it gives some impetus to develop the supply chain further to be more resilient against foreign actors. So, just looking at it from a standpoint of like Germany's investing all this money, but we still got countries like Bulgaria that are further south, and as we've talked about with Avio and Italy, I think it's good that we're seeing contributions from throughout Europe and not just Germany, although it is notable the amount of effort that Germany is putting into aerospace improvements.
So a little bit closer to home, Catalyst Space raised over $5 million in their seed round, $5.5 million, to develop a full stack space logistics system, including satellite reentry. They are based out of the Bay Area, based out of, I believe, San Francisco, though they were originally founded in India. Really interesting company, great team, great founders, and we love to see them succeeding and growing. In addition to those capital raises and M&A announcements, there's also some tech developments that I know you were excited to talk about. So take it away, Harrison.
Yeah, I mean, the big news from last week was all the motion orbital data centers. And the same day that we released that podcast, Planet announced their partnership with Google to fly some of their TPUs in space. I don't think this is on the same scale as an orbital data center. It seems more like a tech demonstration, kind of like how StarCloud is flying NVIDIA's GPUs. But it is interesting to see Planet entering this arena because they're traditionally an Earth imaging and imaging insight platform. And I know they've seen a lot of success from the data side of sales for their business. And so I'm thinking they're trying to expand in that direction with this partnership with Google. It's certainly not the craziest thing to think that they could build constellations of satellites for servers or GPUs or AI data centers, since it's effectively what their constellations already are. And if anything, this is a simpler technical use case in a lot of ways. But I think what we'll see more in the short term more is them proving out the capability of the TPU on orbit, the survivability in that radiation environment, and potentially, the other direction, Google being able to help Planet with their on orbit insights. Having a TPU on orbit along with their camera could provide faster turnaround on some of the processing that they can do to the images they capture, potentially lower the amount of data that has to be downlinked, and just create more responsive products. So it'll be really interesting to see how that progresses. We mentioned last week that Relativity Space is pursuing the orbital data center, and they have the former Google CEO heading up that company. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of partnership that happens between those companies, since they don't really operate in the same environment in the space industry, but they both have Google ties, and I'm expecting very soon that we'll start to see battle lines drawn between the big tech companies once this technology is actually proven out from a technical standpoint.
Yeah. In addition, like there were a couple of opinion pieces that came out since we spoke about the feasibility and pragmatism of orbital data centers last week that poked at and sort of pointed to the magnitude of the physical challenges that F does equal MA, but there are some limitations with the radiative cooling that you're able to get, that the operation through eclipse is going to be a challenge. So there's some definite technical hurdles that still need to be overcome in order for anything to prove out at scale. But it's great to see folks starting with the steps that they're starting.
Yeah, and we're seeing some talk about other areas of this business case already. Once we talked about the technical hurdles, generating enough power, emitting enough thermal heat, you're gonna have to. All the payload stuff's gonna have to be figured out. Like GPUs are not very comfy on orbit. The radiation environment's really tough on them, and just networking them, integrating them with a space platform, all that's going to be difficult. There's a couple companies that announced their partnership this week. Cambrian Works and Aptos Orbital are planning to partner to refine space router and terminals for time-sensitive edge compute applications and consistent cloud connectivity, which is one of the technologies that's going to have to be figured out. It's already working on orbit, but it can certainly be improved, and it will certainly have to be revisited for the scale that we're talking about with orbital data centers. I always get excited whenever I hear space router, because it's one of the most underdeveloped technologies in the space industry, is kind of that wireless connectivity technology. Also like GPUs, they're very sensitive to radiation environments, so not terribly reliable. So any development in that space that can lead to improved reliability and a more persistent connection amongst proliferated networks would be really welcome. And I think that the technology could have a lot of knock-on effects for just how we design satellites in general, in the context of these orbital data centers, but also just in the context of kind of distributed, non-centralized satellite systems. So it'll be really cool to see what they end up building in this partnership. Going back to the space domain awareness aspect, and defense kind of topic, Vantor demoed the Raptor product this past week, which is a solution for drone technology to provide geolocation in a GPS denied environment. So they showed they're able to use the camera on a drone to capture video and use it against their Earth data maps that are captured from their satellites to find geographic markers and figure out the location of the drone and use that in lieu of GPS in order to navigate and fly around. This is a really interesting solution because, as we've talked about in the past, GPS denied environments are becoming more common, especially in war zones where a lot of the proliferated warfighter networks are very important. And most of the solutions to that have been, different frequencies, keyhole satellites, certain stealth technologies. There's a lot of people that are just trying to kind of work around it, but within the same domain. And I think this is one of the most radical shifts that I've seen for a couple of technologies that are advancing very rapidly now. I mean, drone technology is having its own kind of renaissance period now. And these imaging satellites that Vantor operates are pretty state of the art. So using their business strength to kind of implement this new technology, I see there being a lot of value there, especially if it's reliable and they're able to scale it out for, military application. Besxar is another very interesting space company that came out of stealth past week, announcing their intention to launch manufacturing payloads. They have contracted 12 flights with Falcon 9, and this was interesting to me because usually when I hear space payload, I think satellite, but they really mean like a payload for Falcon 9. The idea is that it essentially is a satellite. It has to operate in vacuum under microgravity, in space, but it stays attached to the Falcon 9 second stage to manufacture things like semiconductors and GPUs in that low gravity environment where the crystalline structures can grow larger, more efficient, have better semiconductors and better GPUs. But this is a kind of unique design to the system because keeping it attached to the Falcon 9 means it can rapidly be returned to Earth. So one of the key factors of manufacturing in space is the logistics of bringing it back down to Earth. It raises the cost, it increases the complexity of the satellite. This is a pretty novel approach to it. It introduces some other problems with, you have to manufacture it really quickly because Falcon 9 is not up there very long. But it should significantly reduce the cost of the payload since you're not having to design for long on-space lifetimes or deorbiting with on-orbit thrusters and all of that.
Yeah, there were a couple of different companies that I worked with and have seen that were playing in a similar space of solving this need of there not being enough inventory of what amount to on-orbit testing or manufacturing slots. Like currently, if you want to do something like this, you basically have to book a spot on the ISS.
Yeah.
And so like there are multiple sort of companies that were looking at more or less creating an operations play that improves or provides a whole bunch more inventory, provides a whole bunch more capacity in order to provide this capability. And it's interesting and encouraging to see that Besxar is doing this and is able to actually make progress and has the partnership and the relationship with the Falcon 9 second stage.
Yeah, I was surprised they already have the contracts in place before coming out of stealth, but that's a huge, boost to their reputability. I think they're not competing with many companies. I really like hearing about these companies because it's a cool, not just cool tech, but it's also a use case in space that hasn't really been developed at any scale. Like you said, just the ISS, so it's really for research purposes. But there's actual value being generated from this business case. And so if somebody can figure it out, they're really just adding to the market that is space.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
they're really, yeah.
The reason why the companies that I'm thinking about struggled was that they had difficulty getting that contract in place with SpaceX to become an approved partner on the Falcon 9, right? Like that was the hurdle that was the white whale, so to speak. Like if you can get there, if you can get that, you're in a great spot. So it's great to see that Besxar has done that, and that Besxar is overcoming the I'll say launch partner hurdle. That was sort of the longest tent pole in their success, or in this market's success. But the need and the capability is absolutely there. And to your point, this is something that just expands the market. It just adds more capability. It just adds more value and valuable products and services to the existing market.
Yeah, I mean, I hope they're successful. I hope a lot of these companies are successful. I mean, the other ones I know about are like Redwire, Flawless Photonics, Space Forge, BioOrbit, Outpost Space, Orbital Matter. I think they're all pretty early in this kind of market, with Varda being probably the furthest along, having already launched successfully, manufactured ritonavir, a HIV medication, on orbit and returned it to Earth. So I think they'll be playing a little bit of catch up with Varda, but I think those two are going to be the main competitors, especially with Varda's approach, because they had their satellite built by Rocket Lab, but I believe the last one they launched went off of Falcon 9. So I think it'd be really interesting to see if Besxar has the better relationship with Falcon 9, if Varda could go back to Rocket Lab and have a similar setup with them once the Neutron rocket's working.
Interesting. Yeah, that'll be a fun dynamic to see play out.
Yeah, and the last thing I'm holding my breath on is this New Glenn 2 launch. This is the second launch of the New Glenn. The last one made it to orbit, successfully demonstrated their technology, but failed to land on their barge on Earth. So with New Glenn 2, they've taken a long hiatus to work through the technical challenges they saw with that first launch, and are hoping that this second launch will successfully touch down after delivering its payload to orbit for a second time. And that payload is the NASA Escapade mission. It was built by Rocket Lab, who has been coming up a lot this week, and led by the Berkeley Space Science Laboratory. This is supposed to be a low-cost mission to Mars, so it'll be really interesting to see, if this kind of tech is functional. I think it costs $75 million, which is about half as much as the next cheapest Mars mission. And I think they got the launch for a cool $10 million, which seems pretty cheap for a rocket. But, as it's a demo rocket, I'm glad there's some, benefit to both companies coming out of this partnership.
Absolutely. So hopefully this mission this launch is one of the ones that we spoke about earlier that's able to find a workaround and not be impacted long term. But either way, the partnership between sort of New Glenn and Rocket Lab is one that we want to keep an eye on moving forward.
Yeah, especially since they're launch provider competitors as well.
Agreed. Well, thank you again for joining us this week at the Space Times podcast. As always, I am Paul Mayer here with Harrison Lambert. It has been a pleasure to host you on our journey through the stars, and we'll look forward to hosting you next week as we talk about the news, developments, and upcoming technology and business deals that we see.